In Japan, fewer than 23,000 people file for personal bankruptcy in a single month, even at the modern peak. While in the United States, more than 574,314 people filed personal bankruptcy in calendar year 2025, an 11% jump in a single year alone on the public docket. Those two numbers sit next to each other on purpose, because the entire difference between them is what I want to walk you through over the next 16 minutes. And almost none of the explanation has to do with how much money the average household actually earns on either side of the Pacific today. Japan's population sits around 124 million people, and the United States sits around 335 million. So on a per capita basis, Japan's bankruptcy rate is roughly an order of magnitude lower than America's, a gap that has stayed roughly stable for decades and shows no real sign of closing under current policy on both sides of the ocean. That gap did not appear because Japanese salaries blew past American salaries, because Japanese median household income has tracked closer to Western Europe than to the United States for most of the post-war period, and has often been lower than the American figure across the same years on the same calendar. So this is not a story about earning more money in absolute terms. This is a story about a quiet 120-year-old habit that reshapes the entire relationship between money leaving your hands and money staying with you across an ordinary adult lifetime at essentially similar salaries and similar costs of living nationwide in Japan. The habit has a name in Japanese, kakeibo, which translates literally as household financial ledger. And it has been quietly keeping Japanese families solvent since 1904 in plain ink on plain paper. When it first appeared inside a women's magazine, before spreadsheets existed anywhere on the planet for any household at all. Hany Motoko, generally credited as Japan's first female journalist, published the original kakeibo framework inside the magazine Shufu no Tomo in 1904. Deliberately, as a practical tool for ordinary homemakers who had no formal training in money management and no computer sitting on their kitchen tables in that same year. That makes kakeibo older than modern income tax forms in Japan, older than modern Japanese retail banking as we know it today, older than Japan's stock investing culture, older than the credit card, and certainly older than any personal finance app currently sitting on your phone waiting to send you a push notification later today. The system itself only has 4 steps written in plain language with no app login and no monthly subscription fee. And the chances are good that nobody watching this has ever been asked to do any of them in their entire adult life on a regular basis at home on a monthly cycle or budget review. Step 1 is to write your monthly household income at the top of a fresh notebook page before any money is spent that month, in ink, in numbers, on a single page that becomes that month's financial record from the first yen earned to the last yen spent at the grocery store over the next 30 days. Step 2 is to split your planned expenses into 4 visible categories on the same page: needs, wants, culture such as books, films, and lessons, and extras, all set down before the month actually begins, before the first bill arrives in the mailbox or pops up on a phone screen as a reminder. Step 3 is to sit with the gap between what you plan to spend and what you actually spent at the end of the month, again on the same page, calmly and without self-punishment. So the gap itself becomes a learning artifact rather than just a feeling of guilt at the kitchen table at month end. Step 4 is to answer 4 diagnostic questions before the next month begins. How much do I actually have? How much do I want to spend? How much am I actually spending? And how can I improve next month without overshooting the same way again on the same categories that always seem to soak up the surplus? The pause buried inside step 2 is the actual mechanism of the whole kakeibo system, because the design forces you to decide whether a purchase is necessary before money ever leaves your hand, on paper, with a pencil still in your grip, well before the transaction is over and committed at any card terminal. Western budgeting apps try to automate exactly the same problem in their product roadmaps. Kakeibo instead makes you feel the problem in your hand before the decision is final, and that friction is the entire point of the exercise, not a side effect to be optimized away with a smarter algorithm on a phone. In the 1920s and 1930s, kakeibo went mainstream across Japanese households, with department stores eventually issuing their own kakeibo templates to encourage middle-class spending alongside reflection. And the format expanded beyond homemakers to anyone running a household budget at any income level across cities and small towns nationwide. Between 1960 and 1994, Japan's household savings rate averaged around 1/6 of after-tax income, roughly double the U.S. household savings rate across the same wide span. According to research compiled by the economist Charles Horioka and others over decades of careful empirical work on the same basic question nationwide. At its wartime peak, the savings rate reportedly hit about 44% in some measures, then stayed above 23% through the mid-1970s, all while Japanese per capita GDP was actually lower than U.S. per capita GDP at the start of the window on the calendar in 1960, at the start of the comparison. So if the savings gap had been about income alone, the curve would have moved with the salary curve across decades, and it did not, which is exactly the type of evidence that makes writing things down in a notebook more useful than another round of abstract policy advice handed down from any regulator anywhere this year. By the 2020s, the Japanese macro household savings rate had fallen into the low to mid-single digits in some measurements, dragged down by a rapidly aging population and policy interest rates stuck at 0 or below for years at the Bank of Japan. And yet the cultural habit itself has survived that macro change at the kitchen table level. The cultural habit has not vanished with the macro rate because median savings for Japanese adults in their 50s still sit near 1.2 million yen in recent surveys, with average savings for the same age band near 10 million yen, a wide spread that is itself the fingerprint of long-running cultural pressure to hold a reserve for hard times. About 1 in 3 respondents in their 30s reported 0 savings in the same surveys, which says the habit does not erase hardship for younger Japanese households, but the median Japanese household still holds structurally higher liquid cash reserves than its typical U.S. counterpart in the same calendar year, on the same continent, in 2024. Total Japanese household financial liabilities were reported at about 378.6 trillion yen in 2022, while average household debt sat around 6.55 million yen, which works out to roughly $42,000 at recent exchange rates. A strikingly modest figure against the typical American household carrying student loans and credit card balances at the same stage of life. Compare that to the New York Fed's quarterly report on household debt and credit, which puts total U.S. household debt north of $18 trillion at the most recent reading, an order of magnitude apart in the same region of the developed world on the same calendar that both countries share year by year since 1904 in national data. Across the same broad span of years as the Japanese figures, U.S. personal bankruptcy filings spiked roughly 48% since 2022, according to widely reported figures, with 2025 closing on a year-over-year rise above 11.5% in total filings across the federal court system nationwide in the United States in 2025. Lenders, analysts, and the U.S. federal courts themselves point to inflation, credit card balances, and medical debt as the engines of that 2025 spike in U.S. filings, which is exactly the spending over saving culture kakeibo was designed to interrupt at the kitchen table level, in pen, before the swipe is initiated at the card terminal in any store. Bankruptcy in Japan is also treated as a serious social and reputational event, not a routine consumer management tool the way it functions in the United States. And that cultural stigma compounds the effect of the paperwork itself in ways that compound across generations of families and neighborhoods on every block in Japan today. Modern research clearly documents serious mental health consequences tied to that shame. So this is a description of how reinforcement compounds in real life across households, not a recommendation of shame as a system anyone should design on purpose or export to a different culture wholesale without the consent of the people involved at all. The lifetime employment system that used to backstop Japanese households, the famous salaryman model, reduced the need to borrow against uncertain future income and complemented the savings habit structurally, since the next paycheck could be rehearsed in advance on a written page without drama about next month at all. That salaryman coverage dropped from roughly 30% of the labor force at its peak to a much smaller share today. And yet the savings habit has visibly outlasted the institutional system that once supported it, which is a strong signal that the habit itself carries the weight of the savings rate, not the employer contract at all. Even with the institutional shield gone, Japanese household bankruptcy stayed in the single-digit thousands range most months of recent years, dipping to a modern low around 3,770 cases in January 2016, and never returning to the 2003 peak of 22,991 cases in any single month of any year since that 2003 high. Those are not rounding errors in the data. Those are persistent structural differences across decades of household finance data, and they keep pointing at the same quiet mechanism every single time the numbers come in from the courts, regardless of who is in charge of policy at the central bank in any given decade in the country. If you tried to translate kakebo straight into an American household, your first reaction would be that the procedure feels backwards by modern standards, because mainstream Western personal finance treats tracking as the goal itself, while kakebo treats the pause as the goal, and the tracking is incidental to the larger point. Kakebo treats tracking as a side effect of pausing, and the actual goal is buying less of what you never intended to buy in the first place, which is a much narrower and more behavioral claim than any budgeting app would make in its marketing copy or pitch deck or homepage landing screen for new users signing up in 2026. The 4-category list is also designed to surface wants and culture as their own line items on the page, which is exactly where surplus spending tends to hide in real-life budgets. On the page where the ink is still wet and the entries are still legible to the person holding the pencil all month long at home. The monthly review is designed to be compassionate rather than punishing, because the system assumes you will overshoot some months, and the appropriate response is analysis, not shame, which is structurally important because it keeps the practice going across decades instead of dying in month 3 when novelty fades fast in daily life. That compassionate review is structurally important because it keeps the practice alive across decades of family life, instead of dying in the 3rd month when the novelty wears off and the next shiny app shows up promising automation of the same behavior with push notifications nobody actually responds to or reads carefully on phone. Critics of kakebo are real and worth naming plainly, so you can borrow the good parts without importing the bad ones. It does not hedge inflation, it ignores investment yield. It scales poorly across complex budgets, and it can drift toward past habits rather than forward-looking growth in a changing economy over time. None of those criticisms erase the empirical record, and that record is decisive. Decades of household data with very low personal bankruptcy rates alongside very high personal savings rates for most of the post-war era in Japan in the same decades that the U.S. data moved in the opposite direction over the same years in both countries. Even when Japan's macro savings rate fell into the single digits in the 2020s, personal bankruptcy stayed at a small fraction of U.S. levels, and median household savings across working age groups remained structurally higher than comparable U.S. figures, especially for liquid cash kept on hand at the household level for ordinary households. There is no national kakebo app in Japan. The practice remains overwhelmingly paper-driven even among younger users, which is itself a clue about why the digital-only version of the same idea so often fails in the West when entrepreneurs try to recreate it as a software product with a freemium tier or a paid upgrade. The most cited reasons kakebo does not copy into the West converge on speed, automation, and yield, since Western frameworks keep optimizing for instant apps, rules-based saving, and investment returns, while kakebo is built around friction that nobody in Japan is in a hurry to remove from the kitchen table page in daily life at home. That friction is a deliberate pause that Japanese culture treats as responsible, while most Western personal finance product design treats pause as friction to be eliminated in the name of convenience and growth, which is the heart of the cultural mismatch, and the reason the bankruptcy numbers diverge as they do today on both sides. Major Japanese banks and convenience store chains have started offering branded Kakebo notebooks as part of customer engagement programs in recent years, which is a small but real signal that the practice still travels primarily through paper and through a brand's quiet endorsement of the format itself rather than through a software platform. If you wanted to borrow the habit without taking on the cultural weight of stigma, the actionable version is plain and easy to start tomorrow morning with a fresh notebook and a pencil on the kitchen counter. No app download required, and no monthly fee to pay for anything at all in 2026 or beyond. Write income at the start of the month on paper. Allocate that month's expenses into needs, wants, culture, and extras on the same page. Then review the gap at month end and reset before the next month opens up anew at the kitchen table on the same notebook page in 2026 to keep the habit alive at home. The expected payoff is not investment alpha or 30% annual returns from the market. The expected payoff is the same statistical outcome that Japanese household data already shows on its face across decades of careful work by economists, courts, and government statisticians in Japan year after year on the same calendars. That outcome is fewer bankruptcies, more reserves, and a calmer relationship with what comes in and what goes out across an entire adult life, from age 25 to retirement and beyond. Exactly where the savings rate gap has shown up across the historical record in the national data in both countries over decades on the calendar. The headline worth keeping from this whole discussion is that one country quietly solved personal finance by making people write things down in a notebook before they spent the money. And almost nobody in the West copied that one quiet part of the system at scale across the population in 2026 or earlier this decade. So the next time you hear a personal finance creator say the answer is a clever app that automates your money, remember that a plain notebook has been quietly outpacing the apps in Japan since 1904. And the bankruptcy count after all that time is still measured in thousands, while America's is measured in hundreds of thousands of households a year filing for personal relief in federal court at the same time on the same calendar across the world today in 2026.